Growing up in my small, quaint Canadian hometown, we had a dentist there called Painless Nancy. Nancy was heralded as the greatest dentist to have ever lived. Everyone in my small town said that she was the best. Imagine my surprise when, as a wee lad, I started to go to the dentist and she was anything but painless. No matter how routine or how simple the process was, it was bloody, to say the least. Now, years later, after moving to the big city, imagine how different I felt when I went to a dentist and there were no stabs, no pain, no blood, a completely painless and actually great process from start to finish. After this revelation, it dawned on me that despite everyone's praise and decades of experience for this Painless Nancy dentist, she never really improved that much at her craft, at least in my experience. Now, we as sound designers don't want to end up like this dentist where we put decades of time into our craft, but never really improve. Every single one of us just wants to get better. That's something I see universally across sound designers just across the globe. But considering it's such an esoteric and sometimes vague skill set, it's hard to know what to do next. So in this video, we're going to talk about some ideas on how you can improve at your sound design using something I call the reverse funnel method. So the first thing I want you to do is picture a funnel. I know, I ask too much of you, but just go with me on this. Normally you'd use your funnel for, say, taking your aristocratic afternoon tea, pouring it into the big top, and having it funnel into your fine porcelain china cup at the bottom. But what if we took that funnel and just flipped it over? You'd have to pour your aristocratic high tea much more slowly. But the result would be, if you pour into this narrow top, your liquid would spread out over a wider area. So how does this all relate to sound design anyway? Well, in this flipped over funnel scenario, if you just pour a small liquid into the top, it'll spread out far and wide. Similarly, when it comes to sound design, focusing on just a few things at a time and working on them slowly will actually guarantee results in a bunch of different areas, regardless of genre or style or type of project. For us, it's about depth rather than breadth. And when you do this, you basically guarantee getting skills that will help you across a wide variety of contexts. So what should you even focus on? Depending on your skill level, here's what I recommend. But note that none of this is absolute gospel. The main thing I would say is just follow what interests you out of this list or in general. If you're a complete beginner, the thing I recommend you do on top of learning the basics of digital audio is to familiarize yourself with the tools that you have. Don't worry about going out and buying everything you can, but instead learn the sound library that you already have. Learn what sorts of sounds that are already in there and learn to use them. But in learning to use them, you need to make a lot of garbage. Just make stuff, see what works, and see what doesn't. The next thing is to practice layering, which is basically just stacking sounds on top of one another to create a better final result. One of the biggest gaps I see with beginner sound designers is that they don't necessarily know or even want to layer their sounds, which leads to a really thin, kind of fake sounding result. Something I recommend you also focus on as a beginner when it comes to layering is to focus on the timing of those layers. Most people will just tend to take their sounds and make them all play at the exact same time from the start, and it leads to a muddy mess. Instead, take those individual layers and spread them out time-wise, even if it's very slight. You'll notice your sounds sound a lot more complex and fulfilling that way. And the third thing, if you're a beginner, is to not repeat yourself. A lot of beginner reels that I see tend to have the same sound played over and over back to back, and this sticks out like a sore thumb to any viewer or audio director looking to hire you. Unless you're super intentional about the sounds that you're repeating back to back, you want to make sure that you're avoiding just using the same sound over and over and over again. Now, if you're using clever processing or hiding the sound in some way, sometimes repetition can be totally fine, but just avoid having raw sounds playing back to back over and over, otherwise it does kind of stick out negatively. Now, if you're more of an intermediate sound designer, the first thing I recommend you do is start to learn about blending your sounds together. Once you're able to layer them and stack them on top of one another, then the art becomes making them all sound cohesive. One of the first things I recommend you look into, if you haven't already, is something called parallel processing. Now, going into a video about parallel processing right here might be a bit bit much, but I have a Reaper video coming out that'll teach you a little bit about that. But otherwise, YouTube is your best friend. It's not a super complicated topic. The next thing I recommend you focus on is the awareness of the space that your sounds live in. In the projects that you work on, whether it be film or games, you need to be aware of what kind of space the characters are in or what sort of scene you're setting up. You need to play around with things like reverb and delay and panning to make sure that it sounds convincing to the audience. If you put everything dead center and don't reverb it properly, then it'll sound really fake, really fast. This is one of the skill sets that probably takes the longest because it's so subtle. A lot of people will put a ton of reverb or a ton of delay or pan things hard left and hard right, thinking that that will match the visuals. But the point isn't necessarily to create a perfect recreation of the space they're in, but to tell the story of the space that the characters are doing their actions in. Sometimes an outside space might need no reverb at all, whereas a concrete garage will need to sound like it's in a nuclear silo. You need to play around with that and figure out what the line is for the projects that you're working on. And speaking of telling a story, the last thing I recommend to more intermediate sound designers is to really start focusing on storytelling. I have a video of this up already, but every single sound tells a story. When you are making sounds, you don't want to just put a footstep for the sake of having a footstep there. You need to realize that every sound that you place into your scene or into your game tells people something about that character, about that weapon, about that UI element, whatever it may be. So you want to make sure that every sound that you place or create or implement tells the story that you and the director want to tell. Now, some of you may have noticed that I haven't mentioned things like middleware, like Fmod or Wise. Now, yes, you should definitely learn middleware skills, but nowadays those skills aren't things that make you special. A big mistake I see with up-and-coming sound designers is thinking that if they just learn these two pieces of software, every single job in the world will be available to them. But nowadays, those are just basic expectations. So don't make the mistake that so many sound designers make, where they stop practicing sound design and only focus on middleware, but instead have a little mix of both. Now, if you love the technical part of sound design, go for it, just dive in. But don't make the mistake of sacrificing your sound design skill just to focus on these pieces of software. And if you have no idea where to start with middleware, just take Wise's free courses online. They're excellent. Now, note that all the skills that we just talked about will have a huge payoff across any project that you work on. For example, if you know how to tell a story with sound, that'll apply to literally any game or film or project that you end up working on. Now, of course, there are very specific skills that you will need to learn for certain projects, but so long as you have this foundation set, you'll be able to bounce from genre to genre, to game to film without too much trouble. But Akash, you scrumptious layer of toffee in a layer of thick banoffee pie, you scream. I need to learn everything right now. Well, you know as well as I that the people who try to learn absolutely everything all at the same time end up burning out. And if you burn out, then there's not much of a career in any field for you. It becomes hard to sustain the effort if all you're trying to do is everything. Instead, I recommend focusing on just a couple skills at a time. Then get 1,000,000 reps on those. Move on to something else, get 1,000,000 reps. And then, after you get a lot of practice with these foundational skills, keep moving on to newer and newer skills that interest you. But don't forget to go back to these original skills like telling a story or spatial awareness, because that will still help you and serve you, and it's easy to forget these fundamentals. So let's go over what we covered today. Number one, most people try to just do too much at once, which leads to them spinning their wheels and not really getting anywhere. Number two, you can absolutely get better at sound design by just doing less at a time. You're pouring less into the top of the funnel. And number three, the more you focus on these foundational skills, the more you'll start to realize that these skills apply to any project that you'll work on. And number four, most importantly, my hometown dentist really wasn't so good. So even though you're probably not training to be a dentist in an incredibly small Canadian hometown, we still want to avoid the scenario where we put in loads of effort into our craft and get nowhere. Instead, we can use this reverse funnel method to get better at just a few things at a time, which will lead to improvements across basically every area of our career. And my next online course, Step-by-Step Sound Design, is focused with these principles in mind. We're not going to try and learn everything there is to know about sound design. That's a huge mistake that so many people make. Instead, we're going to focus on just a small subset of skills that will apply to basically any game audio project you'll ever work on. You'll be able to start pre-ordering this course later in November 2023, and it'll be available in February 2024. This time, there will be 350 slots available because usually my courses sell out in literal minutes, but this will give more people more of a chance to get in. I still think it'll sell out, but it'll at least give you a little more time to jump in. But once it sells out, that'll be it. I don't really tend to reopen courses all that often. Now, if you want to be able to sign up and know what all the details are and see the curriculum and all that sort of good stuff, just make sure to sign up for my newsletter in the description below or in the card up above. All right, thanks so much for watching. Go pet a dog.